Welcome to the narrated step-by-step tutorial for my painting Medina County Barn. The photograph on the right was the reference and inspiration for this painting. I didn't make too many adjustments to the overall composition. I like the way the major shapes are in the photograph, but I did change the placement of the values a little bit. If you look, I kept my darkest values in the middle ground, much as they are in the photograph. But I decided I was going to apply a middle value wash in the foreground to help differentiate it from the middle ground and the background. Because this is a very cloudy winter day and it's an overall diffused light and not much in the way of direct sunlight casting shadows, I used some of the contours of the land to help guide me to with the placement of the middle value that I put in the foreground, just to give the suggestion that it's in shadow. And in my painting, much as I did when I photographed this scene, I tried to keep it 1/3 sky and 2/3 land and trees. That's a good ratio to have and try and keep in your landscapes. I begin with a light sketch of the major shapes using a 2B pencil. I'm working on 140-pound cold press Lanaquarel watercolor paper, and this is a quarter sheet. It's 11 inches by 15 inches. I've attached my paper to a piece of gator board just using masking tape. I don't wet my paper. I just tape a dry piece of paper to the board, and I dry it frequently throughout my painting process with a hairdryer. The colors that I used for my painting are cerulean blue, ultramarine blue, royal blue, which is Holbein's version of the pigment PB60. Some of the other manufacturers call it indanthrone, indanthrone, or delft blue. I often get asked about that particular color. I also used alizarin crimson, raw sienna, burnt sienna, and raw umber. I'm going to begin with a sky wash, and I want to convey the feeling of a cold winter day that's just overcast and just a cool feeling in the sky. So I'm going to use a mixture of cerulean blue and raw sienna. That raw sienna neutralizes the cerulean blue and gives it kind of a cold gray sky to try and convey that atmosphere. And I'm not going to have a lot of cloud activity in it. I'm just going to put a simple sky wash on, and that I'm pretty much going to leave it. And as I bring this down, I'm leading the bead of water down so I don't set an edge, and I just have a nice even wash. I'm using a 1-inch flat brush. This is the silver black velvet brushes I like to use for my washes. And as I bring this bead of water down, I'm going to work around the areas that are going to remain the white of the paper. So I'm not using any masking in this painting. I'm just going to paint around the shapes. And right now I'm just painting larger shapes. So I have this kind of a light gray value that I'm bringing down in the sky, and I'm working it around the edges of the whites on the building structures that I want to preserve. But at the same time, I'm going to take that value into the shadowed areas of the buildings and make it one large shape. So I don't have to paint each one of these individual areas independent of one another. I can take this one big wash and bring this value into all these shapes and paint them as one large kind of a light gray value shape here. And then I'm going to paint over those as I develop my painting. But when I'm done applying this wash, you'll see the areas where I'm going to preserve the white of the paper. And at this stage, I'm doing everything with a 1-inch flat brush. I'm going to take this same mixture. I'm going to add just a little bit of ultramarine blue to it to give it a little bluer tone, and I'm going to paint this shadowed area. So it's a little darker than the sky. It's more towards a middle value, and I'm creating this shadowed area to help give me a place to put this middle value and help to start differentiate the foreground from the middle ground. So you can see that I still have just a little bit of raw sienna coming through in this mixture and some gray, but it's a little bit bluer in some areas than the sky. Now that I've applied this wash, you can see the whites of the paper in the areas where I'm going to preserve the whitest whites in my painting. And now the paper is still wet, and I'm coming in with a mixture that is raw umber with some ultramarine blue, and I'm painting the some of the barn and the tree shapes that are in front of the barn. So I'm working wet and wet right now, and I'm getting soft edges because I'm working wet and wet, and it's not going in to the areas where I preserve the white of the paper because it's dry, and that dry paper resists the flow of the paint, except in the areas where I intentionally took some of that wash up over the roof of this barn structure because these trees are overlapping. But now, because I'm working wet and wet, and I have the roof lines and the areas that I want to keep the whites dry, I can come in and work with this kind of a cool brown tone and some warm areas too. But I can lay this wash in working wet and wet and don't have to worry about it going in to the whites of the paper where I preserve, because that paper is dry, and your paint in this condition, when it's wet like this, is going to follow the path of least resistance, and you'll be able to preserve those areas as whites without worrying about masking them unless you brush over top of them. As I mentioned, for the brushwork that I've been doing here, I'm using a mixture of raw umber and ultramarine blue, but I've also used some burnt sienna and some raw sienna there, where you can see those warm tones in front of the larger structure that to represent those trees. There's some raw sienna and burnt sienna mixed in there. You can see how very quickly, using large washes, I've started to define this composition. That wasn't a lot of small brushwork, but you can make out the building structures, and you can see the highlighted areas. And I'm going to blot the surface of a few of these areas just to soften some edges a bit more and lighten them up. And right now is a good time to do some scraping, because it's at a point where there's just a sheen to the paint. And in some areas it's still a little wet, and other areas it's started to dry up a little bit. But I can take this plastic scraper and I can scrape some branches and some trunks into the wash that I've applied. I'm going to continue scraping some tree trunks and branch shapes into the other side of the composition here. We're just making some linear marks, and again, you can only do this when the moisture content in your paper is at a certain point, and it comes and goes very quickly, so you have to keep an eye on it. It needs to be a slight sheen to the paper. It can't be so saturated that paint flows back into it, and it can't be very close to dry, because you won't be able to move the paint. You're not actually scraping the paper, you're moving paint. So here I'm taking a broader edge, and I'm making some marks into the paint just to give some variation to the foliage of the trees. When scraping, you don't just have to scrape thin linear marks. You can also scrape some broader shapes. You can use these along like the shoreline along a river, or you can scrape out some rock shapes. So don't limit yourself. Experiment a little bit. As I begin to paint some of the tree shapes here, I'm going to insert the photo so you can see how it's starting to develop as a painting. So I'm taking a liner brush here, my larger size that I use, and I'm painting these trees with a dark value mixture of royal blue and raw umber and a little alizarin crimson mixed in, but it's a dark value, and I'm trying to give the feeling that these are broken up a little bit by the other branches, and it gets kind of tricky trying to paint the foliage or to give the suggestion of these trees without leaves in front of this building. So it does take some planning, and right up front I put that kind of a soft wash down to give the suggestion of all those branches on the tree, and then I'm coming and painting over top of them with some darker values to give some definition to the trunks of the trees and the branches. But I'm letting that initial wash that I put down that has soft edges give the suggestion of a mass of branches in a winter scene here. If you've seen some of my other winter videos, you probably have seen me paint a scene similar to this where I've used masking fluid. I like to use those as a way to create the feeling of snow falling and the sparkling of it laying on the trees. I could have taken that approach to this subject matter. It would be a good subject to use that technique, but I decided that I was going to take a different approach with this one and do this without masking fluid. But that approach definitely would have worked with the trees and the overlapping of the branches to some of these other larger shapes. It's a good technique that you could also paint this subject matter with. I'm going to take a dark value and I'm going to start to paint some of the darker areas of this barn structure. So this is a mixture with some royal blue, raw umber, little alizarin crimson, some ultramarine blue in it. And from time to time I'll mix in a little burnt sienna or some raw sienna, but the key is that it's a darker value. And I've got a 1/2 inch flat brush that I'm using, and I'm just painting some darker value to give more definition to the building structure. As I work this value around the barn here, I still want to preserve the feeling of the softness of those trees in front of the barn. So I'll be breaking these marks up a little bit here and there so that I can maintain some of the feeling of that tree. And you'll notice also I frequently use a tissue to soften edges. I'll just gently blot an area that I painted to soften the edge so it's not quite as hard as first applied. So here again, still a 1/2 inch brush, and I use all sides of the brush. I'll use the corners, I'll use the tip, I'll use the edge, I'll use the flat side to make various brush marks. And I'm going to take this darker value and I'm going to carry it up into the silo, which is to the right side of this building. Because right now it's all part of the same wash that is the trees, but it's going to be a darker value up top, and that will help differentiate it from the roof and from the trees. And you can see when working with a flat brush like this, you need to twist it. Like I said, I'll use all parts of the brush. I'll use corners and edges to make the mark that I'm after. And I'm going to take this same value and I'm going to take it over to the structures, the lower structures to the right of the main barn. Also, you'll see I just put my hand there. I'll take my hand and just touch an area that I just applied paint to, just to give some interesting texture and variation to a brush mark that I've put down. So here I'm taking this value And you can see there's two buildings here, but I'm painting that dark value as if it's one shape, because the value just kind of runs together. I'm going to take some of this mixture I've been using with a little bit more water added to it, and I'm going to paint around the building a little bit just to give some more volume to these trees here in the background. I want to get a little more substance to these trees that are overlapping the building, so I'm coming in with a mixture of some burnt sienna and ultramarine blue with a little raw sienna in them. And I'm just applying this with the wash brush. This is a round wash brush. That's the one that's a jumbo round, small, still the silver black velvet type. And you can see there's some warm and cool there. So it's the same colors, but the ratio of the colors is I vary to drive it either towards warm or cool. So a little bit more burnt sienna takes it to the warm side, and a little bit more ultramarine blue takes it to the cool side. And it's still very neutral. And here I've softened using a fine mist spray to soften some of those edges. Now I'm going to take the darkest value that I've used so far, and this is a mixture of royal blue and raw umber, and it's got a lot of pigment in it, so it's a very dark value. And I'm using a detail brush. This is a quill brush I like to use. It holds quite a bit of paint, but it holds a good point. And I'm going to paint some smaller shapes in this composition, in particular on some of these building structures, to give a little bit more definition and provide some more interest to what's going on there. Not rendering these per se, but I'm making some darker valued brush marks to suggest direction of the surface and some shadow areas and just the various elements of the building structure. So here I'm taking this and I'm just making some marks underneath the edge of the roof there that would be a little darker. And but I'm taking the same mixture and I'm working across the structure, and I'll work across to the other structures too. And I'm not concerned about mixing a new paint mixture or different color. This is a pretty limited palette, but I'm just trying to convey this kind of a cold winter day here on this farm. Going to paint more of this shape, and at this point I could be using a larger brush, but I can still use this brush, the side of it, to cover a larger area. Now I'm going to bring that same dark value across to these other two buildings here, and I'm going to paint this shape here that's enshadowed a darker value. I'm going to paint that whole shape this darker value. And you can see how just adding this value builds another layer in this value scale. And then really I'm at the point now where I really go the full value range from the white of the paper to a very dark value, which would be a 1 on the value scale, which is almost a black. Now I want to take some of this brushwork to the other side here of the building, and but it's not going to be as extensive because I want to preserve what's happening with the trees there. I am applying some of this darker value to some areas of the trees, the trunk and some branches, just in spots, just to create some variation and break some of these shapes up a little bit, some of the linear shapes. I'm going to do the same on this other smaller tree. I'm also going to take this darker value to the what I'll call the shadowed side of this barn, and just make that shape a darker value. Still trying to break it up though in a few areas, because there's branches that are sticking over this area and elements that are part of the tree. So I'm trying to maintain the feel of that as I paint this darker value on this side. Next, I'm going to paint these lightning rods that are on top of the building here. They're just nice linear marks, and I'm using a number 1 liner brush that I have with just kind of a middle value gray. I've decided that I need to go a bit darker with this wash I have in the foreground. So I'm taking a mixture of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, and I'm going to apply a wash over top of what I put down previously. And because the paper is completely dry, I'm going to get a nice even wash over top of the one that I had put down before. So I'm using a round wash brush here. This is the jumbo round small that I like to use, and just applying a nice even wash over top here. So this helps differentiate the foreground a bit more from the middle ground, and it helps build depth into what's going on in my painting here. When I first put this wash down, it was very early in my painting process, and I didn't have anything to really compare it to. Now that my painting's evolved and I can see the range of values, it stands out to me that I didn't go near dark enough for this to be middle value. By deepening this value a little bit, I've helped differentiate the foreground more from the middle ground and background than I had with the lighter wash. And I'm going to put a mat on this to get a good look at it. And that's my painting, Medina County Barn. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you haven't already, check out my Facebook group, Rick Surowicz Watercolor, friends and subscribers. And as always, if you have questions about my material, you can go to the studio page of my website, rsurowitzart.com. And if you have questions, you can email me at contact@rsurowitzart@gmail.com. Thanks for watching.